Another very good early morning to all of you. Once again, it is 2:30 in the morning and we are studying the Bible. In this great state of Tennessee, there is nothing else better to do. Amen. We left off in the previous chapter, 1 Samuel 12, where Samuel, the prophet of Israel, the final judge, is giving a warning unto the people, and he says, even though you all have chosen Saul to be your king over God, God will still bless this nation if you obey him. But if you don't, if you do wickedly, then expect many, many curses. We pick up now in 1 Samuel 13:1. Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel. Let me stop right there. This is a highly debated verse, because if you look this up in other translations, you're going to get, and Saul was 30 years old, and Saul was 40 years old, and Saul was 1 year old, or something ridiculous like that. I mean, it runs the whole scale, and it's incredible just how much confusion that there is with this verse. Out of all my research, the KJV is the only one that actually has it right and makes sense. It's the only one that actually makes. Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, plain as day to me and you, right? Other translations, they trick people like crazy anyway. But before I go any further, I would like to establish something. We know that King David began to reign at the age of 30. King David, who would succeed Saul. But we're not, to my knowledge, and I looked this up, I spent many minutes looking this up, I could not find how old Saul truly was at this point. In my opinion, Saul was about 40 years old at this point. Whenever he became king, he was about 40, I would say. We do know for a fact that he reigned for 40 years. In Acts 13:21, we're told that. So we know that he reigned for 40 years, but I couldn't find where it states at what age he began to reign. If you do know, please leave a comment, because I would like to know, and then I'll correct all of this. But this is in Saul's second year of his reign that 1 Samuel 13 is talking about. Saul chose him 3,000 men of Israel, whereof 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and in Mount Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin, and the rest of the people he sent every man to his tent. This is the first established army. He actually breaks it up into two camps. It's only 3,000 men. It's not many, like the massive one that we read about in 1 Samuel 11. And Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that was in Gibeah. And the Philistines heard of it, and Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, let the Hebrews hear. Now, Gibeah, many people say, is Gibeah, but really it's a land, as far as I know, it is a land located near Gibeah. And it's right in the midst of so I believe that the Philistines had conquered everything coming up into this point. They had a massive army that we're about to learn about. And so they were, over this 2 year period, we can tell that they were really, really gaining ground. If they weren't conquering, they were just all around invading the land to come to fight Saul. And all Israel heard say that Saul had smitten the garrison of the Philistines, and that Israel also had an abomination with the Philistines, and the people were called together after Saul to Gilgal. So Saul, he has been in Gilgal for a while now. That is basically the place where he got to celebrate his great victory over the Ammonites. But right here we see that Israel is now looked at as an abomination unto the Philistines. They had a type of shaky, really, really shaky alliance where Israel was kind of the subservient nation to the Philistines. But now the Philistines hated them because of what Jonathan had done at Gibeah. And this is a very common response from bullies. The Philistines are like the bullies. And we'll read about how, at the end, towards the end of this chapter, how they didn't allow Israel to have sharp or swords of any kind, spears of any kind. Only the king and his son really had swords. And the Israelites actually had to bring their plowshares and their farming equipment unto the Philistines and pay them in order to have them sharpen them. And so the Israelites were being big brothered by the Philistines. They were watched over constantly. And now all of a sudden, whenever Israel's wanting to actually stand up to them, the Philistines hate them. Now they were okay with them until the Philistines or the Israelis stood up to them. And that's just like a bully. You stand up to a bully and he gets offended that you're not letting him boss you around or belittle you or demean you in any kind of fashion. And they take offense to it. And you've lived in an offended state for a long time because of it. One should know, new Christians, that this is also the way that Satan will come against you. Once that if you're doing what he wants you to do, I used to go to parties all the time. And I used to live the most ungodly, just a godless existence every moment. And I felt fine. It felt like I was getting high all the time. I was getting drunk all the time. Other stuff, rock and roll, all that. And it seemed like nothing bad ever happened. Everything was okay. But then all of a sudden, something bad would happen. And it seemed like many, many rains it pours type of scenario. Many, many things would happen all within a span of a week. And it was just, I don't know, it had to have been God. It honestly had to have been. I was doing Satan's work. And then all of a sudden, whenever I became a Christian, I started to notice it wasn't the same as before. It was a harder life in the sense that little bad things would happen. Co-workers wouldn't, they just wouldn't like me for whatever reason, or, and some members of my family and friends, they seen me as very strange, and, that kind of isolates you. And then you know that you appear strange to people, but you can't stop doing what you're doing. You can't stop that joy from spewing out. And I believe that it's Satan trying to throw those little darts at you, And it's really not darts, it's javelins. It's usually in the biblical sense, it's like javelins. It's not so much darts, it's just something with a very sharp point. And the Philistines gathered themselves together to fight with Israel. 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen, and people as the sand which is on the sea shore in multitude. And they came up and pitched in Michmash, eastward from Bethaven. Now we'll get to the location that they're gathering right here, but in the commentary, the commentary that I was looking up, it angers me so much. I just cannot stand reading some of these people whom don't stick to the KJV, because they seem to be so fluid in how they take the Bible. They'll say, well, it's like this 30,000 chariots. I'm not going to name who it was, but there's many of them who don't use the KJV, and they say this was a copyist error, and this was it was more like probably 3,000, and it's like, what are you doing? But this was I found a lot of angst with this. Anyway, the Philistines have this massive army, and it's so numerous that and people as the sand of the seashore in multitude. It was massive army, massive. And they also had some of the best weaponry that you could have found. They were a seafaring people, and they traded a lot with the Greeks. And much of the weaponry introduced into Israel And the other nations came through the Philistines because they would trade with such modernized nations. When the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, for the people were distressed, then the people did hide themselves in caves and in thickets and in rocks and in high places and in pits. Upon researching this chapter, I've never been in a war, but I've boxed people. I've went head on. I have gotten to fights and stuff, scraps and whatever. And I can probably gather just a fraction of what a soldier feels, maybe one millionth of a fraction of what they feel whenever it comes to the anxiety, whenever it's kind of a lawless battle. There's no ref there, you don't know, you could die in it. I mean, honestly, but they're looking at what appears to be annihilation. Israel. What appears to it's going to annihilate them. So, yes, they are fleeing for their lives. And as we all know, they still are fleeing for their lives, even to this very day. This article shocked me. Absolutely shocked me. It's from The Guardian. And it takes me back what I read in this about the bomb shelters in Israel today. Let me just read for you what this says, just the title of the article. You can look this up. This was a few years ago in 2017. Doomsday dens inside Israel's bomb shelters in pictures. It starts to show them, okay? So these are just some of the bomb shelters, and it shows you picture after picture of them. There are more than 1 million bomb shelters in Israel. Let that sink in. There are more than 1 million bomb shelters in Israel, reflecting the nation's collective siege mentality. But fear of doomsday hasn't stopped people adapting them into gyms, rehearsal rooms, and even dance class venues. They have, and right over here it says this, a fragile normalcy. And the article says that they're trying to make it a normal thing within Israel to use these bomb shelters, because at any time unconventional warfare could transpire over in Israel, and a nuke or heavy bunker busting bombs could go off. And so they have to be, and it's 1 million. That means that underneath Israel, and even some of them probably above ground, but they have these bunkers and these shelters that they can go to. That is how heavily under attack that these people have always been. I have never heard of a people so hated, so under attack all the time, seemingly. You always read about it in the news. Israel attacked again, Gaza, and another missile going on. We're reading about it in the Bible right now. The Philistines are wanting to annihilate them. Constant under attack. And 90% of the time, it is for no reason of their own. It's just because they're Jews. Just because they're Israelis. Just because. I mean, the Israelis, they were enslaved for 400 years before they ever even, came into Canaan wanting to take it over and whatever. They were oppressed for hundreds of years before then. And it's astonishing. I would recommend everyone going and reading this article. I also did a little digging on the psychological warfare that happens to people involved in such dire circumstances as we see the Israelis in against the Philistines in 1 Samuel 13. And we see them hiding. They're hiding everywhere. They're not even trying to fight them. They're facing death. William Sherman was a general for the Union Army during the Civil War over here in America. And he said this: "I am tired and sick of war. Its glory is old moonshine. It is only those who have neither fired a shot nor heard the shrieks and groans of the wounded who cry aloud for blood, for vengeance, for desolation. War is hell. And even Jesus tells us that in hell there's weeping, wailing, gnashing of teeth. And it sounds very similar to what the general of the Union Army actually says right here. He says that the people, you have not heard the shrieks and groans of the wounded. The shrieks and groans, there's wailing and there's weeping within these wars. War is hell. Now, I'm about to show you all a few clips from a documentary about PTSD, shell shock, and that they face, and how the term shell shock actually came from bombardments, bombs actually dropping around men and not even hitting them, but affecting them so badly psychologically that they are no longer themselves. They're no longer human beings after that, or in the sense of normalcy that we would know. No, they're changed into this fearful being that it's absolutely petrifying.
During the First World War, a new condition emerged that caught the military and medical establishment completely off guard. There was no telling who would be affected by it or why. Those who suffered from it might be hypnotized or electrocuted, arrested or shot, all for the same illness. So many men were lost to it, there would be a revolution in military attitudes and a new field of medicine created. The condition was called shell shock.
I suppose shell shock made much sense. It captured exactly what was happening. There were lots of shells around, there was lots of blast, lots of shock, and people, after being blown up or buried after being blown up, were in a state of shock. So I think it was a wonderful term because it described it quite perfectly.
To the Army's alarm, more and more cases of shell shock began to appear. After just 6 months of war, 15% of the British Army was judged to be suffering from the condition. The most extreme cases were blind, deaf, mute, or shaking, yet all without an apparent cause, other than their proximity to bombardment. Similar cases appeared in the French and German armies on the Western Front. Myers realized that the causes of shell shock were far more complex than he'd first thought. He was now convinced that shell shock was not a physical problem, but a mental one. Soldiers' unconscious minds so distressed by war crippled their bodies and took them out of the fighting.
When you see so much death, you obviously believe that perhaps the next bullet or the next barrage will have your name on it. And it is fearful. Some weeks, some people were frightfully brave, and yet the following week, they could hardly hold things together at all. It's a variable entity. Fear of death, fear of being afraid, seeing so much death. Really a nightmare. So how do you cope with it? I don't know. How do you prepare for it? I don't know. Perhaps you can't.
But shell shock, in its own terms and in its own logic, has always existed because arrows would be coming down at the time of Ahab, and he knew about this, and he even dressed up not as the king of Israel, but he dressed up as a common soldier or captain of such. He dressed up as one of the commoners, that way they wouldn't target him so much. And these arrows could kill you, and just like it killed King Ahab, these arrows. So this kind of psychological trauma, which we refer to today as PTSD, it's always been around in warfare, and there's a reason, because you're facing death. Now, the great difference in between the time of the Israelis back then fighting and the whole world and Israel facing now, what they're facing, as well as the whole world, is that now it can be annihilation. Now it can be total wipeout of mankind if the nations get too carried away. Back then, they would just meet up as they're doing during the Philistines. But Albert Einstein once said this: I do not know what weapons the Third World War will be fought with, but I know that the fourth one will be fought with sticks and stones. Because our weapons today are so detrimental, so devastating. I've looked up a little bit about the most powerful weapons that we can find or that we've invented, and you couldn't sleep at night. And that's just the stuff that you can find out. Someone sending a missile from 500 miles away right through your door, blowing you up, killing you and your family, and you never even know it. It hits you, literally, you probably just hear a pop and see a white light, and then you're at judgment. And that's how deadly that they are now. We face a time now unlike any other time in history. Just a couple of 100 years ago, people were still riding horses and carriages, and we've advanced so quickly. And Jesus says at the end that knowledge shall be increased. And we see that now. Knowledge is increased for the worse, for the most part, I believe. But now perhaps you can understand why these people were hiding. And some of the Hebrews went over Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. As for Saul, he was yet in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. And he tarried 7 days, according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. But Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. And Saul said, Bring hither a burnt offering to me, and peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. Many, many years after this event, we will learn about another king in the time of Isaiah the prophet. We'll learn about a king Uzziah, whom he attempted to burn incense. He attempted to take the place of the priest. And he was the king of Judah. And God struck him with leprosy on his head for this. God takes this very seriously. There's a clear distinction between a king and a priest. Okay, the king deals mainly with the people. The priest is speaking to God. And it came to pass that as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him, that he might salute him. And Samuel said, What hast thou done? And Saul said, Because I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that thou camest not within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash. Therefore said I, The Philistines will come down now upon me to Gilgal, and I have not made supplication unto the Lord. I forced myself, therefore, and offered a burnt offering. Now pay attention to what Samuel replies. And Samuel said to Saul, Thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee, for now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever. This has far more depth to it, thou hast done foolishly, than what me and you would look at it as. The Bible always refers to the fool as an unbeliever, as an atheist, as an agnostic, someone who is lacking in faith or love of God. And this truly shows the heart of Saul. But now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart. And the Lord hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee. Now we'll learn that it's many, many years later, and Saul is still king. But after this instance right here, because God allows the full 40 years to transpire for Saul to be king over Israel. And I believe that he did that in order to say, no, now you all know he's not a good king. You know he's not a godly man. You know he's fearful. You know that he's not the man that you thought that he was. He says, but you're going to bear it. You are going to have to live with this man now over you, because you rejected me. And Samuel arose and gat him up from Gilgal unto Gibeah of Benjamin, and Saul numbered the people that were present with him about 600 men. And Saul and Jonathan his son and the people that were present with them abode in Gibeah of Benjamin, but the Philistines encamped in Michmash. Okay, so right here you see Gilgal, and Gibeah is right here. Right here's Gilgal, right here's Gibeah, and right here is where the Philistines were located at Michmash. So if you'll see just how far that they had traveled, came all the way to Michmash to meet Saul at Gilgal, then Samuel, all three of them, Samuel, Saul, and Jonathan all go to Gibeah. And the spoilers came out of the camp of the Philistines in three companies. One company turned into the way that leadeth to Ophrah, unto the land of Shual. Right here's Ophrah. Going, and these were pillagers. And another company turned the way to Bethoron, and another company turned to the way of the border that looketh to the valley of Zeboam, toward the wilderness, the valley of Zeboam toward the wilderness. And right here, there's an upper and a lower Bethoron, and that would have been right here. Right here was Ophrah, once again. And the valley of Zeboam was north of Gilgal and Jericho, actually north of Jericho. And we know it today as the valley of Achor. Now there was no smith found throughout all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make them swords or spears. This is actually something about what the weapons would have looked like back then. Pretty interesting. But all the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen every man his share and his coulter, and his axe and his mattock. Yet they had a file for the mattocks, and for the coulters, and for the forks, and for the axes, and to sharpen the goads. So it came to pass in the day of battle that there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people that were with Saul and Jonathan, but with Saul and with Jonathan his son was there found a couple of swords, 30,000 chariots. Looks like doom, doesn't it? Israel seemingly always, even go back to the time of Abraham even, and then come to Gideon fighting the Moabites. They're always seemingly outnumbered. And I believe that God does this to test them. And the most obvious answer is to just test them. But they faced odds unlike, it's almost unbelievable. This is it's the very first page of Dave Hunt's Judgment Day. And Judgment Day speaks on the last days and how the Muslims, the Middle East, has so much to do with the last days. And Shimon Aram, he was one of the most renowned generals in Israel. General Israeli Defense Forces, retired, one of the most celebrated Israeli generals of all time. He wrote this. This is a quote about Dave's book, and he tells their situation back whenever Israel first became a nation again in 1948. We're starting right here. In 1948, when the state of Israel was just reestablished, 600,000 Israelis faced 80 million Arabs. 600,000 Israelis, not even a million, faced 80 million Arabs. 60,000, this was the army, 60,000 ill-trained and ill-equipped Israeli soldiers of a newly organized army, 6 months old, he should know because he trained them, crushed 600,000, a ratio of 1 to 10, soldiers of 4 Arab armies, well-trained and heavily armed, reinforced by units from 7 additional Arab countries, not to mention the active help of the British. They have faced these kinds of wars for as long as you can imagine. And it's over and over again. They're facing these kind of obstacles. Now you kind of get a little bit of a sense about how they felt back then. Of course they're going to be scared. They're going to be terrified. The story that everyone points to is David and Goliath. And David was an Israeli and Goliath was a Philistine. So I mean, it goes all the way back to there, and everyone uses them, David and Goliath, for the examples of the small beating up on the big, because they've always done this, because God has been with them. God has protected them. God gets the glory whenever 60,000 ill-trained and ill-equipped Israeli soldiers, mainly farmers, crush 600,000 well-trained and well-equipped Arab with help from the British, our allies. God gets the glory, and we'll see how he has always gotten the glory, and he always will get glory, to the glory of God. But that is our lesson for today. I hope that you all learned something. I'm not going to keep you up anymore. Tomorrow, Lord willing, we'll get into chapter 14. Lord of peace be with you. Amen.